I want to go ahead and introduce our two panelists. So Will Austin is our first panelist, and Will received a Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from University of Illinois in 1990, and worked with Cooper Industries, held various positions there in quality assurance, manufacturing, engineering, shop floor supervision, engineering supervision. And at Ohio State, he studied the Vietnamese, Mexican auto industry in graduate school. And prior to graduating with a master's in business administration, he worked for the Ford Motor Company. After graduate school, he studied Chinese at Northern Transportation University in Beijing, China, and then worked for General Motors Declo Electronics Division in Singapore. Held several financial positions in Indiana, and then took an 18-month assignment in Sao Paulo, Brazil, at Delphi Automotive Systems South American headquarters. It was in South America that Will began to develop a dream of a simple car that could bring transportation to the developing world. In 2000, he began working on designs for a vehicle and founded the Institute for Affordable Transportation. And I'd like to also welcome Dr. Greg Bixler. Greg Bixler is the CEO and co-founder of Design Outreach. You guys saw a video from him earlier. And he teaches engineering courses at Ohio State University on AT for developing countries. He came up with the idea for Design Outreach in 2007 after seeing extreme poverty up close and personal in Central Asia, realizing that he could help alleviate suffering using his engineering talents. And so in 2010, he founded Design Outreach, and his endeavors have led him to 23 countries while serving as CEO of Design Outreach, resident director for the OSU Service Learning Program, and an advisor for the OSU student chapters of Engineers Without Borders. And Dr. Bixler was employed at Battelle before returning to complete his doctoral research in mechanical engineering at OSU. So with that, I would ask, go ahead and start with you, Will. If you would just give us time's going to be short here, so we just want to give just a short introduction into of your work with the BUV and Affordable Transportation Institute, Will, and any other things you might find relevant towards this topic. And then we'll move on to you, Greg, and just give a brief introduction. And we'll go ahead and open it up to some questions that people have already posed and other ones that come in.
All right. Thanks, Elliot. Thank you all for attending. And yeah, I've been working on this for 20 years, and the Lord laid it on my heart, and it hasn't scaled up as fast as I wanted, but he has provided a way for it to continue. And, basically we just wanted to have a way for farmers to get crops to market. And we looked at what can we take off the vehicle that's not absolutely critical to transportation. And that's basically how, we've aimed at developing the BUV, is just making it as simple and robust as possible. And let's see, right now I'm going to be talking about two factory attempts that we did. One was a couple years, one was about 6 years. And we're preparing for our next. So hopefully we've got some lessons learned for you. And is that enough, Elliot? I don't want to talk too long here.
Yeah, that's great for now. We'll hear from Greg, and then we can go back to some lessons learned and things like that in just a second. Thanks, Will. Sure. Greg?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you also for tuning in and being part of this discussion and learning with us, because I feel like learning how to create appropriate technology is a lifelong learning endeavor for me, and I'm sure for all of us. And but it's a pleasure to be able to share, like I did a little bit earlier on the fair here. But we've we started about 15 years ago with this idea that we can create better technologies for the 90% of the world that's basically being ignored when it comes to technology development. And we started in water, with the water pump being the thing that our missionary partners were telling us was one of the biggest problems, pumps that break down quickly and can't go deep enough. And 15 years ago, we thought that would be an easy problem to solve. And then we learned a lot along the process, how difficult that would really be. But we also were very keen on creating technologies that are scalable and creating a process to scale those, not just pumps, but a variety of technologies from wash and medical devices and agriculture, for instance. And part of that is identifying the requirements and problems, which you heard from one of the speakers. It's the ideation phase of creating those technologies and prototyping, and then it's the implementation, which is probably where most technologies end up crashing and burning, because implementation and scaling is far more difficult than creating a prototype that works on a small scale or one region. But to make a global impact for Christ and to be a gospel patron that can get these technologies into our proclaimers' friends' hands, it requires scaling them. And so that's something we've gotten involved in piloting and advocacy, working with Ministry of Water government officials, for instance. And it's been a great learning experience and journey, but it all comes down to solving problems that people think they have. And that's kind of the foundation of what we're talking about here. So thank you. Thanks, Elliot.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Just to get us started, I see a few questions coming in here. We had a few questions to begin with too. And since we're focusing more on the idea of once we have this technology, how do we produce it, replicate it, manufacture it in country to be widely used and help the most people we can. And I think both Will, you and Greg have had some good experience sorting through those issues of taking an idea and the technology that works and trying to get it in the hands of the people that need it and help scaling it up in ways locally. So I would be interested. One of the questions that we received earlier was, what's the process that you go about? I have a technology that has been developed in the country that they're working, and it seems to work. It's successful. How do we go beyond just making a few one-offs to actually getting something into more people's hands that could be a useful step for them to be bringing themselves out of subsistence? Will, do you maybe want to start with just a few lessons that you have learned from trying to do manufacturing in country and that process that you guys went about?
Sure. We initially, for our first 7 years, we're mainly building the vehicles here in Indianapolis, and then we'd send them to missionary headquarters that were shipping containers, and these would ride in the containers. And it's a low-cost way to go if there's shipping room on the container, but if there's not, it's just way too expensive to ship it commercially to the product or to the country. And so our next step was like, why can't we just do a simple plant, a micro factory in country? And that's what we did. In Tanzania, it went from basically 2012 through 2018. It began to wind down more into just a service center. And there's various reasons for that, but our goal, we really wanted to create jobs there. We wanted to create the pride, the dignity associated with, building a product that's really helps people. And, in the big picture, looking back, one of the things we probably tried to do too aggressively is jumping in with both manufacturing and assembly at the same time. And as a lot of locations or a lot of products that are made in Africa, they generally start out with assembly first, if it's a fairly complicated product, and then move to manufacturing. And that's what we want to do going forward. We jumped into both, and beyond just what Dr. Bixler was talking about, beyond the technology, there's the business part of it, and scaling the business and running the business and the service side. And complexity wise, we just got probably too much going at the same time. And I think that's an easy trap to fall into. So that's definitely one of our big picture lessons learned is, jump in, let's get in with assembly. And once they get that down, maybe it's a year, maybe it's a couple of years, then introduce the manufacturing part. And by that, I mean, we manufacture the frame of the vehicle. And not that that's overly complicated, but it's doing everything at once is quite complex. And we ran into many challenges where our managers there were just pulled in many different directions trying to grow this business. And ultimately, we were not able to continue there. So I'll leave it at that for now, but we can jump in more of that later.
Great. Thanks, Will. I think you bring up some good points. The idea, the difference between manufacturing assembly or actually manufacturing parts in country. And, we talk a lot about using what you have to make what you need. And I think both of you, there's a spectrum of technology that, we can easily produce in country, and some specialty parts that may need to build up a supply chain to be able to make a technology successfully work. And I think, Greg, you might have a good perspective on this with the life pump. And it might be nice to hear a little bit more about the life pump, as far as you guys still are manufacturing here, but I think moving more towards establishing a center in Malawi. And it'd be great to hear a little bit about that, but also, the difference that you shared a little bit in the video too. There's a difference when, for example, the life pump, you're pumping water from depths that no other hand pump can. And that's because you have tight controls on your manufacturing. So there may be a point where there's a difference between accessing water and not. And if we keep ourselves in the mentality, purely in the mentality that we can only use whatever scraps we have around and call it appropriate technology, we may be really crippling ourselves in the long run. But we have to do that wisely. Obviously, we know so many projects that have failed because they weren't locally made and not able to be locally serviced in a supply chain. I know you've talked some about that before. Would you mind just maybe giving a little insight into building up sort of a supply chain in country and support network, and maybe in your future direction of potentially even moving into more light manufacturing in country?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. This is a very complex topic, and there's a lot to unpack there. But what it really boils down to is value proposition. Is there a strong enough value proposition to justify the technology that you've created? And then on the other side, there's the different approach, the two different ends of the approach spectrum of appropriate technology development. It's the kind of dating myself, the MacGyver approach, using local materials and building what you needed, all the way through the very high tech, or I should say proprietary or imported parts approach. And I think for a long time, when you read the books and talk to people and, various opinions out there, the holy grail of appropriate technology is if you can build it in country using local parts and labor and technology, manufacturing. But the truth is, if you've had a lot of experience going to these countries, there's just not a lot available. And so if we can, if we can do it with local materials and parts, then that's the best. But in many cases, accessing water from 500 feet in the ground is just not possible with the materials and manufacturing and resources that are found in most developing countries. So then it becomes a value proposition issue of investing upfront from the NGO or missionary perspective to say, we're going to spend more money upfront so that we can do something that will last a very long time and not require a lot of maintenance and not require this super robust heavy duty supply chain as compared to something that's going to need to be fixed every 3 to 6 months. Maybe if it's fixed every 5 years, that looks a lot different than every 3 to 6 months. And it's a mental shift of something's better than nothing, and how communities are being trained over time that they get stuff and it breaks quickly and easily, but it's cheap to fix. But the reality is that it's not cheap to fix because the stuff's not getting fixed. And in the case of Life Pump, we, from the very beginning, we had questions both from donors, from NGO missionary partners, and from the government asking us about in-country manufacturing. And we started looking at that. And number one, as I mentioned, there's not a lot of in-country manufacturing. And so we have to build that capacity in country. And Will would be able to attest to this with the BUV. The issue is it takes a lot of money to build in-country capacity. So now we need to show there's a demand before we can invest, in our case, donor dollars, or even if you have an investor, if it's a for-profit thing, we have to justify that there's a return on investment in setting up local manufacturing, training local people. And so we want to make sure there's a demand there before we can invest that money. And so the strategy was, let's continue manufacturing where the lowest cost manufacturing is for this. In this case, it's the United States. Ship it in containers that makes sense from a financial shipping perspective, and then start introducing components that could be made in country, which is what we're doing in Malawi, where we're setting up light manufacturing to make certain components that are difficult to ship. For instance, like the pipes we use. So we direct ship the tubes, ship the machined ends, and then do in-country welding. So, and our plan is to continue building capacity as we get more trained people, there's more demand. And if we train somebody on how to weld and allow them to use equipment, that they can find other jobs to make a living from that as well. And so it's basically building a factory and building capacity, because we don't want to set up a manufacturing company in whatever country, and then there's not enough work for them to do, and then they have to go get other jobs and you lose your manufacturing base. So it's a tricky thing, but it takes a long-term investment. I think 10 years should be our focus on a lot of these projects. It takes 10 years to get things adopted and set up and running, and that's 10 years of hard work. But things that can be made locally, with one of my favorite examples is, like, you might be familiar with, like, the tippy tap. I think that's a brilliant design. Using local materials, it's very effective. It can be easily fixed. Great design. Can it be improved on? Absolutely. But are people willing to pay more money for a better tippy tap? I don't know. Those are things we have to study. But in other cases, tippy taps work because of just the simplicity of the design. But in other cases, that may not work. So it's really a dependent type of question. What manufacturing is appropriate?
Thanks, Greg. So I've got a couple of other questions, and if you all have questions out there, please be posting them in the chat, and also if you'd like to speak, feel free to speak as well. Just make sure to mute and unmute your microphone. But there was a question earlier on the Whova app that was asking about government, the government's role, and how to encourage the government to adopt or promote appropriate technologies and manufacturing of appropriate technologies. Maybe you mentioned that, Greg, and I'm sure both Will, you and Greg have had plenty of dealings with figuring out governments to work with them. Could you provide any insights to people out there that may be trying to build technologies, start manufacturing in country? Any lessons that you all have learned?
Yeah, I'd be happy to kick that off and then turn over to Will. I think getting government acceptance for a new technology is really critical. And some technologies are government regulated, some technologies are not. So in the case of hand pumps, the Ministry of Water and Irrigation would regulate which standard technologies are allowable, and then theoretically enforce those amongst the NGO partners that are putting in pumps, for instance. So with their endorsement, it's very important that they endorse and accept in national policy a new technology. And in that way, it basically uncuffs NGOs who follow government policy to then use that technology. So that's a very critical aspect. Government acceptance of a regulated technology could, in our case for Life Pump, it took us 5 years because they want to see a pilot. They want to go to the communities. They want to see the studies. We wrote papers. We went to conferences. We did all the things that we had to do. And then, of course, along the way, we're praying a lot because these things don't happen. There's turnover in government. There's just, other priorities that they get distracted on. And so we have to keep bringing this back and fighting for the people who need this technology desperately. And eventually they got to the point where there was so much evidence that they couldn't say, no, but it involved even members of parliament. It's figuring out the politics and who makes decisions and who does what was a giant puzzle we had to figure out before, even though the technology was working great, just like we said, we had to figure out the politics of things to know who to even talk to and who needed to make that decision and how they made a decision. And that's going to be different in different departments of government that regulates ways of doing things. And then with the government approval, I wouldn't say, and I, just in my personal experience, government approval is not necessary to start manufacturing in country, but they also are very, very happy in general when you can manufacture in country, employing local personnel, as well as exporting to other countries. And so that becomes something that especially elected officials or appointed officials are very happy to hear, because it's bringing in funding into their country. And then lastly, there's a sense of pride and there's a sense of sustainability when things are being made locally. And what I mean locally, I don't mean in the village. I mean in the city where you might set up a manufacturing or partner with a manufacturer if that exists. There's a pride factor that people are very happy about, but of course there's challenges, just the way the HR system is set up and so forth. And I've heard from various sources where it's easier to go to India and do low cost manufacturing and then keep it in whatever country. So then there becomes this determination factor of, is cost the driver, or are you willing to invest money and resources into sustaining manufacturing, even if it's cheaper to go to India or China? And that's a tough decision. And that has to be part of the mission and vision of your organization in creating technologies, because right now it's probably cheaper, especially in any sort of volume, to go to other countries that are already set up for mass production. So the question is, what are we trying to solve when people would say, Life Pump, you need to make that in Africa? I would say, well, the problem we're trying to solve is not bringing manufacturing to Africa. The problem we're trying to solve is getting water to communities. If the best way of doing that is making it in Africa, then, let's do it. But if the best way to do it is to make it in England or United States, then that's the best way to do it. And so kind of the question is what is our goal? Is our goal to do local manufacturing? And does that really increase sustainability, or is our goal something else? And I think that's a very tough question, because it seems on the surface, local manufacturing is the way to go. But I can name a number of organizations that have started with local manufacturing and then shifted out of country because quality control wasn't good, turnover was high, just having reliable electricity in country, like all these things just add up to where running a factory is very difficult unless that's your mission and vision as an organization.
Thanks, Greg. Will, do you have anything to add to that? Government role in appropriate technologies?
Sure. One wonderful thing is if you can get the government involved in what you're doing, as far as at least exposure and stuff. They did, like in Tanzania, they gave us several opportunities. We set up our little factory, BUV Tanzania did, in a place called CEDO, which is like a small innovative development organization throughout Tanzania. So CEDO actually is broken up by regions in Tanzania, and the leader of CEDO wanted to help promote what they were doing in our region. So we kind of rode that wagon to various conferences, as well as like the National Parade down in Dar es Salaam. So there's benefits that way to having the local government on board. In Rwanda, this is the first time that we tried to meet with kind of the top officials first, right at the beginning of the project. And that was very helpful too. We met with the Minister of Agriculture, and she shared that she wanted us to focus on milk transportation. A lot of milk sours before it gets to the creameries. And so that opened a lot of doors, but Rwanda is also an example of government policy shifting, and the president came out and said that we want all the motorcycle assemblers and motorcycle importers to switch to electric. Well, our partner in Rwanda was a motorcycle manufacturer, assembler, I should say. And so when this policy hit, they looked at everything and looked how much they were going to have to invest to switch their product line totally over to electric, and they ended up throwing in the towel, and they sold it to one of their directors, and the director really is now, I mean, they're trying to just survive through this whole COVID thing, as well as just decreased demand and trying to bring in a new product line. So that project's totally on hold as we wait to see what shakes out. But that's an example of where a government, mandate totally changes the whole business model. And like I say, the major investor that did this, which was our partner, they were out of the West Coast, and they lost a chunk of money on their investment. But they did not, at the time that this mandate was announced, there was only one electric recharging station in Kigali, and they looked at investing in building more of them, and they just couldn't justify it, and so they just were fed up and left the business, sold the business. So that's an example of where top-down policy can work against you. So that's some of our experience with government.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, I really appreciate the points that you both have made. Greg, the idea of understanding what our outcome is, I think is really important. What problem are we trying to solve? I'm so sorry that Lance wasn't able to be here, because he comes from a perspective maybe on the other end of the spectrum of his objective is, yes, to solve a problem using technology, but I think he's more focused on building up a local source of employment and sacrificing some inefficiencies in the product in order to keep it boosting employment and industry locally in country. But of course, like you said, it all depends on what question are we trying to solve, and how what margin of error do we have? If we're not solving that problem every moment of every day, is it a life or death issue, or are people able to find alternatives when things aren't as reliable? And what is the end goal? I think that appropriate technology can be used in both directions. So I think it is important to see both sides, and I appreciate both of your guys' perspectives on that. One of the questions kind I just want to make a note too. I'm getting a few questions here on specific technologies, what would be best in certain areas. We probably won't have time to address those specifically in this session, as far as what technology might work best for your individual situation. But I would be happy to address those with you all afterwards, and I can I'll send my email in the chat here. You guys are welcome to contact me, and I can get some more specifics on your situations and see if we can provide you with some information that might help you along the way. But I did want to, I think, especially since we have both the BUV and the life pump being manufactured mostly out of country and then assembled, or light manufacturing in country. I think the big question that comes to mind for people, Edward points this out right here, how do you deal with maintenance issues of technologies developed and built out of country? If the BUV breaks down or if the life pump breaks down, who fixes it and who takes ownership? What has been your experience, Will and Greg, in the support, the parts network, repairs? What kind of track record do you all have with keeping those technologies working if they have been developed and built out of country? What kind of barrier has that posed, or how have you overcome that barrier?
I can share one mistake we made in Tanzania. We started this factory, invested quite a bit of money. We were thrilled to get orders. And so we would say yes to orders anywhere they were. And in retrospect, in Tanzania, you can drive 12, 13 hours in a particular direction. And some of our customers were that far away. And had we to do it again, and eventually we actually ended up buying back some of the BUVs that were furthest away because it was just so hard to service and train and interact with the customer that we bought them back and then resold them locally. And I think there's a whole lot of value of being able to say no to some orders and have a focus area where you develop some critical mass of activity. Tanzania is a huge country, and we got really spread out. Plus, we were selling into some of the surrounding countries. And in retrospect, I definitely wish we would have focused on an area and really hit it hard. I'll stop with that and let Greg talk a little bit here on this.
Yeah, this is a big question. These are tough questions here. That's why we're all on this call and putting a lot of brain power behind it. Supply chain and manufacturing is highly connected, but also design is highly connected. So it's all three of those have to go together in order to create resilience or sustainability. And so part of it is, it's like, think about supply chain that we ask our brothers and sisters in developing countries to work through versus supply chain in our own country in the United States, or wherever you're at. I'm just going to pick on the United States where I'm at right now. My car has components from all over the world. So if a part breaks, I don't run down to my local, welder and ask them to fix it. It's being shipped in, it's being put in a warehouse somewhere. It's being, brought to my auto mechanic if I can't fix it. And that's how sustainability is being built, and resilience, even though a lot of stuff is being imported to, like, the United States. Even though we could theoretically build some of this stuff, we're not set up for it. We're not building a lot of manufacturing. We're not doing a lot of manufacturing in the United States. So then thinking about the idea of village level operations and maintenance, what does that actually mean? Can people actually repair stuff the way we think they should be able to, when we're not even able to do that with all this manufacturing in our backyard? And so when I look at it, it's a combination of, how do you get to resilience? Well, one is you want designs that need very little maintenance, that can last a long time in between when things break, but also not actually break. Failure is or repair is a bad word. It should always be preventative maintenance. How do we make things last a very long time? And then you start to see indicators that something needs to be done, and do preventative maintenance so that there's never this emergency run. There's never this catastrophic failure that people are scrambling to go fix. And whether that means parts are being made in country or being imported, it really doesn't matter. It comes down to an economics of things. Can you affordably get the parts needed and the service personnel into the last mile distribution? Does that mean it's being made in country, or does that mean it's being made halfway across the world? And in the end, it's just a money issue. It's an economics of, does it make more sense economically to build it in country or to import it? With the once again, the holy grail is to make everything in country. I think that's the goal that everybody has. But as the technologies are getting traction and being built up, I think importing is the way to get there. It provides that initial boost. And and I'm talking about things that have to be imported. If there's capacity in country to build a part, by all means, build that part in country. And by all means, that's going to help the supply chain. That's going to make things better. Just an example for Life Pump, we a lot of the parts are not, they can't be made locally. But one of the parts, we adopted the base stand from the India Mark II and the Aphrodite. Now those are imported parts, but widely accepted as available in most developing countries. So instead of building our own bases, which are still better quality, and I won't get into the issues with quality control in some of these manufacturers, they're good enough for what we're using them for, to where the tolerance issues and things are still acceptable with the way we designed our pump. So we're able to procure local bases in whatever country versus making them in the United States and shipping them. And that's just one example. And the more things we can do that way, the better. But supply chain and manufacturing are highly related, and having parts in country available and whatever it means to be affordable is really critical. And I think it's all about long-term commitment. And that's where a lot of our NGO partners and missionaries are really struggling. Like, how long, and it kind of comes down to this question, to be honest, it's how long are our donors willing to keep helping the same community? It comes down to how much money are we willing to invest in each community versus doing a project and moving on, doing a project, moving on. And I think that's where we have to really analyze community development and what technologies we use, and then the value proposition to whether somebody wants to buy your technology and scale it.